Okay, so this is a prosecution closing. He gets to say his closing. You're going to see the opposing counsel taking copious notes on points that he wants to say where he got it wrong or whatever. So he's already got his closing figured out on his points, but he's got to do on-the-fly closing on what he brings up. So after he does his closing, defense will do their closing, and then he gets a second bite of the apple. He gets to come back and readdress and try to tear down what he said. But the defense doesn't get a second chance. He gets one chance. The government, the state, gets two. Deck's always stacked. House always wins. The government wants to win. Here we go. Closing arguments. Prosecution.
May it please the court, counsel, members of the jury. His name was George Perry Floyd, Jr., and he was born on October 14, 1973, in Fayetteville, North Carolina.
So what he's doing now is humanizing, having the jury connect with the victim.
To his parents, George Floyd Sr. and Larcinia Jones Floyd, Sissy, the matriarch. Now, you met George Floyd's brother, Philonis, and you heard all about Sissy Floyd. She was George Floyd's mom. She was the mom of the house. She was the mom of the neighborhood. And you heard about the special...
And she had a son that was using drugs and was ODing and using counterfeit money and been to prison. Oh, I'm sorry. We're talking about how great she was. I'm sorry.
Bond that she and George Floyd shared during his life. You heard about their relationship, how he would always take time, special attention to be with his mother, how he would still cuddle with her in the fetal position.
Oh my God, are you serious? I must have missed that in trial, but man, we're making this guy in 50 years old and he's still cuddling?
You heard that. And from George Floyd's brother, you learned all about George's childhood. And during his time growing up in that house, George Floyd was surrounded by people he knew, people who knew him.
Is that the prison library? Oh, I'm sorry. That must have been an earlier photo.
People he recognized, a familiar face to pick out in the crowd. People need that.
You notice we didn't hear in this trial about George Floyd's extensive criminal history, how many times he was arrested, how many times he was in jail, how many times he was in prison. Do you notice somehow none of that was covered? Yeah, that's what I'm talking about when the jury doesn't really get the facts. They just get what the state wants them to know so they can get their conviction. See, the state right now is kind of trying to paint the picture that they care about George Floyd and they care about the family. They don't give a shit about George Floyd or the family. This is about publicity, money, the system. They're getting bragging rights. They're going to get a book deal. They got on TV. Anybody that thinks that any of these attorneys give a shit about George Floyd, you don't get it.
George Floyd was surrounded by people he cared about and who cared about him throughout his life, throughout his childhood in that house, through his adolescence, into his adulthood. On May 25, 2020, George Floyd died, face down on the pavement, right on 38th in Chicago, in Minneapolis.
While doing drugs, committing felonies, fighting with the police, eating drugs. Oh, well, never mind that. He just died on a pavement. It was all Chauvin's fault.
9 minutes and 29 seconds. 9 minutes and 29 seconds.
See, to me, this fake, it just turns me off. I hate it when attorneys do that. And maybe it's because I know attorneys, and I know how they are, and I know they're laughing and joking when they're preparing these and all this. And they get in front of a jury, and they think they're freaking actors. And they want to act this concerned. Oh, this is so horrible. I just can't believe. Please. Come on. Can anybody see this guy's faking his emotions right now?
During this time, George Floyd struggled, desperate to breathe, to make enough room in his chest to breathe.
Make enough room in his chest to breathe, yet they brought in a witness to testify that his oxygen level was 98%. I mean, that is what a normal living person, I mean, my oxygen level is probably 97, 98. And I'm living and moving around, and I'm not doing drugs. George Floyd's oxygen level, according to their expert, was 98% when they got him to the hospital. How can you say he died of lack of oxygen when he was at 98% oxygen level? I mean, it's just crazy.
But the force was too much. He was trapped. He was trapped with the unyielding pavement underneath him.
Oh, it's a pavement fault. If we only had reasonable pavement control, we could do it. Pavement must be racist. It's killing black people. It's the pavement's fault.
As unyielding as the men who held him down, pushing him. A knee to the neck, a knee to the back, twisting his fingers, holding his legs for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. The defendant's weight on him. The lungs in his chest unable to expand because there wasn't enough room.
Now, normally, the DA would be walking closer to the jury because they want to connect with them. And they would be moving in front. But because of this COVID, he's kind of stuck here with the microphones. So this isn't how a normal closing would be without this COVID stuff.
To breathe, George Floyd tried. He pushed his bare shoulder against the pavement to lift himself, to give his chest, to give his lungs enough room in his chest to breathe, with the pavement tearing into his bare skin.
Man, that pavement was just freaking mean.
As he desperately pushed with his knuckles to make space so he'd have room to breathe, the pavement lacerating his knuckles.
I'm surprised the defense isn't making notes, but it's funny. He's making this all about the pavement, and he hasn't mentioned once that George Floyd was committing a felony and was fighting with the cops for however many minutes before this 9 minutes. That hasn't been mentioned. And how do we know that George Floyd was trying to get air? Maybe he was just trying to escape like he was. Remember, he said I couldn't breathe when they were putting him in a car. He didn't want to get in the car because he's claustrophobic. He fell on the ground before they even put him in the car. Then when he got in the car, he was kicking. Then when they pulled him out, he was kicking. No. It was the pavement killing poor George Floyd, and he was tearing up his knuckles trying to breathe. I mean, it's just such a phony story to me.
Knuckles. The defendant stayed on top of him for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. So desperate to breathe, he pushed with his face. With his face.
Yeah, I've never had a suspect trying to get away from me that didn't push with all their body and all their parts to try and get away. That's never happened to any cop.
To lift himself. To open his chest. To give his lungs room to breathe. The pavement tearing into his skin. George Floyd losing strength. Not superhuman strength.
See, we don't want to have the jury think it was superhuman strength, because that would imply the drugs had some sort of effect. And their whole case is the drugs and his health and all the other resistance had nothing to do with this case. It was all Mr. Chauvin.
There was no superhuman strength that day. There's no superhuman strength because there's no such thing as a superhuman. Those exist in comic books.
Obviously, you didn't see the video I just did where the guy pulled the bobcat and threw him, but that was pretty superhuman. But I digress.
And 38th in Chicago is a very real place. Not superhumans. Only humans. Just a human, just a man, lying on the pavement.
Just a man lying on the pavement. It's like he was out there trying to get a suntan and the cops came over and started beating him up for no reason. Are you kidding me?
Being pressed upon, desperately crying out. A grown man crying out for his mother.
I'm not sure if that helps you, dude. That's kind of pathetic. A grown man that's been in prison, that was committing felony and taking drugs, that fought with the cops, and now he's calling for mama. I'm not sure that helps you.
A human being. And in that time, and in that place, while he was surrounded in life by people he knew him, faces he could pick out, there was no one there he knew. He was surrounded by strangers. Strangers, all of them.
Had he not been trying to pass counterfeit money, he wouldn't have been in that place. Oh, I guess you forgot that.
9 minutes and 29 seconds. He's surrounded by strangers, not a familiar face to say his final words. But he did say them to someone. He said them to someone who he did not know by name, but he knew him from the uniform he wore and the badge he wore. And he called him Mr. Officer. That's what he called him, Mr. Officer. Mr. Officer would help. We call the police when we need help. And he pleaded with Mr. Officer.
Oh my God. I mean, that's a valid point. Floyd did say that. But a lot of people who shoot cops will call them sir or boss man or Mr. Officer. I mean, that people who have been in prison in the system a lot knows that I can be nice to a cop to get them to drop their guard. So the fact that he's saying Mr. Officer to me as a cop doesn't really matter. His actions of fighting and trying to eat dope and trying to get out of the car and falling on the ground and screaming and passing counterfeit money, those matter to me. The fact that he calls me an asshole or Mr. Officer really doesn't matter. But it may matter to the jury's heartstrings.
George Floyd's final words on May 25, 2020 were, "Please, I can't breathe." And he...
Not only were they final words, they were his first words. When he was walking and standing outside the car, he was saying that.
He said those words to Mr. Officer. He said those words to the defendant. He asked for help with his very last breath. But Mr. Officer did not help.
You know, it's funny. As Chauvin is sitting there, I'm sure he's thinking, how many times have you DAs used me to get convictions, to say I was a great guy, to say I was trustworthy? You use my warrants, my affidavit, you use my sworn statements, you use my police reports to put people in prison based on that I was a good guy, honest and trustworthy. And now, after 19 years of DAs using him for their own means, now they get to use him again for their means. Wow, the irony.
The defendant did not help. He stayed on top of him, continued to push him down, to grind his knees, to twist his hand, to twist his...
Grind his knees. I don't know, man. I might object to that because there was no evidence of him grinding. But objections during closings I never could get. Sometimes you can do it. Sometimes I never understood exactly when and how you could object. It's very limited.
His fingers into the handcuffs that bound him, looking at him, staring down at times.
So since he's all emotional right now, trying to pull the emotion strings, he's not making notes. And I was kind of like, damn, why aren't you making notes? But it's because he really isn't making any points. He's just kind of talking shit, trying to get the jury to feel sorry for George Floyd and to hate Chauvin. That's been their whole case. I mean, there's really nothing he can argue with that. So maybe that's why he's not taking notes.
Horrified bystanders who had gathered and watched this unfold. The motto of the Minneapolis Police Department is to protect with courage.
Have you watched TV, dude? The motto of any police department: protect and serve, whatever. Are you kidding me? Do you think anybody believes that shit? Well, it's not important until we can use it against somebody to promote government's wants and needs. Government wants to blame somebody. They want everybody to hate them. They want the people to have trust that government cares about them and is going to protect them and going to hold people accountable. See, they want to paint this picture, but in fact, this guy don't give a shit about any of that. Again, it's all about how can I manipulate 12 jurors to believe my bullshit, because this case is just full of crap. I'm not saying George Floyd should have died, and I'm not saying the cops are right. Everybody wants to jump to that conclusion. Man, you're biased. You don't care about George Floyd because you're racist, and you just like Chauvin because he's white. It ain't got nothing to do with any of that. It's about the fairness of the system and how government uses and manipulates people for their own means when really they don't give a shit about George Floyd or Chauvin or any of you. They care about themselves, their power, and their position. This is about government accountability, and government's not being held accountable. Government's using Chauvin as a scapegoat for their actions, which they're going to go back to doing as soon as this case is over.
And to serve with compassion. But George Floyd was not a threat to anyone. He wasn't trying to hurt anyone.
Well, see, he kind of said two different things. He wasn't a threat. We don't know that. He was fighting and resisting. He was a threat enough to where the cops had to pull their guns because he was fighting and eating dope and trying to destroy evidence in the car before they got him out. Then he was a threat when he wouldn't get in the car, and it took 3 cops to put him in the car. Then he was a threat when he got out of the car and he was kicking the cops. It took 3 cops to hold him down. So to say he wasn't a threat, I mean, to me, sounds like a lie. But what do I know? In a country of lies, truth is treason.
He wasn't trying to do anything to anyone. Facing George Floyd that day, that did not require 1 ounce of courage, and none was shown on that day. No courage was required. All that was required was a little compassion, and none was shown on that day. George Floyd said, "I'm not trying to win." This was a call about a counterfeit $20 bill.
Like, that's okay. I mean, he says it like, people, go out and get counterfeit money. It's not that big of a deal. Go out and spend it. It's all okay. I mean, the way he's just kind of throwing off a federal offense of possessing, making, passing, using counterfeit money, a federal offense, and he's making it seem like, come on, man, it was a $20 bill. And it wasn't just 120. It was multiple 20s. He passed one. He tried to pass a second one. And they found others in the car. Well, actually, it wasn't in the car. The guy tore it up and threw it on the ground.
All that was required was some compassion. Humans need that. People need that.
Okay, he's writing here. So I'm not sure what he said, what his point's going to be here.
But more fundamental than that, and more practical, at that time, in that place, what George Floyd needed was some oxygen. That's what he needed.
According to your expert that you brought back, his oxygen level was 98%. Maybe he didn't need oxygen. Maybe you're just saying that to make your case.
He needed to breathe. Because people need that.
Yeah, they need that when they have a 90% blockage in their heart, when they have high blood pressure, when they put illegal drugs in their system like fentanyl and methamphetamine and marijuana and caffeine and nicotine and Suboxone or whatever.
Humans need that.
Humans. We got to make them
breathe.
human. Humanize them.
And he said that. And the defendant heard him say that. Over and over. He heard him, but he just didn't listen. He continued to push him down, to grind into him, to shimmy.
Oh, he's using the black guy's word shimmy. Grind. Let's say what the witnesses said.
To twist his hand for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. He begged, George Floyd begged until he could speak no more, and the defendant continued this assault. When he was unable to speak, the defendant continued. When he was unable to breathe, the defendant continued beyond the point that he had a pulse. Beyond the point that he had a pulse, the defendant continued this assault. 9 minutes and 29 seconds. When the ambulance arrived, the ambulance was here, and the defendant continued. He stayed on top of him. He would not get up. He would not let up. He stayed on him, grinding into him, continuing to twist his fingers, to hold him down. He had no pulse. He was not breathing. He was not responsive, and the defendant had to know what was right beneath him.
Now this part is where I think that's where I kind of lost it for the cop. When he stopped breathing, even though the crowd was there and he was looking around, and I think one of the other cops said, "Hey, should we roll him over?" And he said, "No, let's stay." And I know what he was thinking. I mean, I get it. He didn't say not roll him over because he wanted to kill him. He said, "Don't roll him over because we finally got him stable. We've been fighting with this dude since we got here. We had him in the car. He's on drugs. We don't know what he's going to do or when he's going to freak out. Let's not do anything until the ambulance get here, and we'll just stabilize. As long as we're stable, we're not hitting him, we're not hurting him, we're just holding him down." And I think that's what was in Chauvin's mind. It wasn't, "Oh, I'm going to kill this guy today because my life's boring and I just want to kill somebody and a bunch of witnesses when I know I'm on videotape because it'll be fun." I mean, come on, people.
Right beneath him. You saw the video. You saw the point when the ambulance arrived, and finally, after a paramedic got out, and the defendant still did not get up, and the paramedic tapped him, and finally the defendant got up, and they lifted Mr. Floyd onto that gurney, and you saw the way he was not, there was nothing there. His head.
See, I don't think he's allowed to say he was dead. You notice they don't say he was dead.
Had to be held to prevent it from falling to the ground. He was completely limp. The defendant had to know that. He was there. He was on top of him.
I think the defendant supported his head when they put him on a gurney, if I'm not mistaken.
And he was on top of him. On top of him. Sometimes you ask for the truth, sometimes you insist on the truth. And the truth is the defendant was on top of him for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. And he had to know. He had to know.
He wants to focus that he was on top of him, and he wants everyone to ignore why was he on top of him. What caused him to be on top of him? The actions of drugged out George Floyd.
The medical examiner would find the cause of George Floyd's death to be cardiopulmonary arrest, complicating law enforcement subdual, restraint, and neck compression. Well, what you saw the defendant and the other officers doing to George Floyd caused his death. The medical examiner ruled the death a homicide.
This is misleading because we all heard testimony on how they define a homicide, and this is not a legal definition, and it doesn't mean that he murdered him. But this is a ploy by the prosecution to confuse a juror who's not paying attention and said that the medical examiner said he killed him, must have killed him.
Death at the hands of another. What the defendant did to George Floyd killed him. It was ruled a homicide the defendant is charged with murder. He's charged with murder and he's charged with manslaughter. The defendant at the time was a police officer. Okay? It may be hard. It may be hard for any of you to imagine a police officer doing something like this.
It's not hard for me. I don't find it shocking that a cop would do that, and I think cops ought to be held accountable. But I think this case is not about holding anybody accountable. It's about finding a scapegoat, about color.
Remember, in jury selection, and we talked about bias and we talked about setting biases and preconceived notions behind. Well, imagining a police officer committing a crime might be the most difficult thing you have to set aside, because that's just not the way we think of police officers.
I laugh at you.
We trust the police. We trust the police to help us.
Really?
We believe the police are going to respond to our call for help. We believe they're going to listen to us.
I don't even think he believes that bullshit he's saying right now.
And this is strong. This runs deep. It's difficult to set this aside. I want you to consider that even after, with the bystanders, after they saw what they saw, after they saw this shocking display of abuse of police power and a man murdered in front of them, Genevieve Hansen, she called the police. Donald Williams, he saw this. You heard him. He testified. He called the police.
Calling the police doesn't prove anything. I mean, he's making it sound like that makes him guilty, but in reality, just because someone calls the police doesn't prove a damn thing.
A 9-year-old, Judea. What did she suggest? We need to call the police on the police. That's our expectation, even after seeing this, even after witnessing this. Our expectation is that the police are going to help. And with reason, and with good reason, right? Because policing is a most noble profession. It is. It is. And to be very clear, this case is called the State of Minnesota versus Derek Chauvin. This case is not called the State of Minnesota versus the police. It is not. Policing is a noble profession.
So now he's trying to separate Chauvin from the good police because the police are government, because he needs the police, because he wants to let the police know that he's on their side and that he's not going to charge another cop for anything like this unless there's public outrage. So let me distance Chauvin from the police and make this one isolated rogue officer that's been on a department for 29 years, who has commendations and medals, who we've used 100 to 1,000 times in court to get our prosecutions on other people, and we relied on him. No. It's all his fault. It's no one else's that cops are out of control and allowed to do this. It's not the chief's fault for having a policy that allowed him to do it. It's not the chief's fault for stopping other police brutalities that's been going on forever. No. It's all Chauvin's fault. He's the white guy. He's the bad guy. He's the one to blame. Okay.
And it is a profession. You met several Minneapolis police officers during this trial. You met them. They took the stand. They testified. Make no mistake, this is not a prosecution of the police. It is a prosecution of the defendant.
It should be a prosecution of the police. That's my big point. Is cops are out of control and they allow this to happen every day, and now they're picking and choosing because of color on which cases to prosecute to make them look like they have some legitimacy, and they don't. Cops are out of control and the DAs protect them every day.
And there's nothing worse for good police than a bad police who doesn't follow the rules, who doesn't follow procedure, who doesn't follow training.
Actually, he did follow his rules for training and procedure.
Who ignores the policies of the department, the motto of the department.
29 years or 19 years and you're just figuring this out? This guy's been on the department 19 years and now you want to point out that he's been rogue and disobeying the policies? Really? I mean, that doesn't make any sense at all. Except it makes sense on the incompetence of the agency and the government.
To protect with courage, to serve with compassion. Chief Arredondo, the chief of police in Minneapolis Police Department, he took the stand and he testified and he told you what that badge that he wears over his heart means.
Oh my God.
It's a public service.
I'm getting teary
here. It's a
here.
public trust. They're there to help us.
It's a badge.
It's a professional organization. There are standards. There are rules. There's a code of conduct.
Wow. I feel so proud. I had one of those badges, so I must be good too. Whatever.
There's a use of force policy. There's extensive training. The police are first responders. They're who we call for help, and they help us. They have CPR training. If there's more training than simply use of force. There's more to policing than putting handcuffs on people.
Oh, he just said they have CPR training, and he wrote that down. I never heard anything about anybody testifying that he was trained in CPR, other than basic first aid and academy. Maybe I missed that.
People and hauling them away to be true, right? There's other kinds of training. There's procedural justice. There's crisis intervention training. There's medical training. And there's defensive tactics. And there's de-escalation. All of this training. Hundreds of hours of training. You met the people who staff the training center. And they told you, we don't train this. They told you that. The sanctity of life and the protection of the public, those are the cornerstones of Minneapolis Police Department's use of force policy.
Okay, so some DAs, for those that haven't been in court, he knows he gets a second bite of the apple. Some DAs will make their first opening shorter, and then they'll let him talk, and then they'll hit all their points on the last, so it's the last thing they hear. So I'm not sure what he's saving for his second. His thing may be, I'm going to cover everything, and then I'm just going to rebut what he says. But we'll see how he does this.
The protection of the public, all of the human beings that make up the public. He didn't do that because that day his badge just wasn't in the right place. The defendant was a police officer. He was.
Oh
and
my
again,
God, here we go.
We need to set aside the notion that it's impossible for a police officer to do something like this.
So I'm thinking he's not allowed to show Floyd in the closing, but he showed this picture so many times and Burn It In that by showing this picture, everyone knows what his knee's at and where Floyd's at. That was a sneaky lawyer trick, I think. Unless he shows him later, there may have been an agreement that you can't show Floyd's face during your closing. But he was allowed to show his face, so he uses this picture. Sneaky lawyer tricks. Just so I can win, because that's all I care about. I don't care about George Floyd. I don't care about anybody. I just want to win, so I can say the government wins.
The defendant is on trial not for being a police officer. It's not the state versus the police. He's not on trial for who he was. He's on trial for what he did.
Oh, maybe
that
I can't
is what
show
he
it.
did. That is what he did on that day. 9 minutes and 29 seconds. That is what he did. He didn't follow training, those hundreds of hours of training that he had. He did not follow the department's use of force rules. He did not perform CPR. He knew better. He just didn't do better. He just didn't do better. Remember during opening statement, counsel said that the defense...
Wow, he's reaching. He's not even going to witnesses. He's attacking the counsel's opening statement. Damn.
Defendant followed the rules and followed his training. Did you hear evidence of that? Did you hear evidence of that from the stand? Or did you hear something quite different? The chief of police testified. He violated their use of force policy. He violated their de-escalation policy. He violated the duty to render emergency aid. No. You heard the trainer, Lieutenant Mercil. We don't train this. This is not who we are. No. That representation was simply wrong. That's just a story. What the defendant did was not policing. What the defendant did was an assault. I'm going to discuss the law with you in a bit here.
Good, great.
And explain, the court's already provided you some instructions on second-degree murder, and you know that under the laws of this state, if you commit a certain level of assault, a felony level assault, and a person...
I know some of you get mad when I bump this up, but he's just rattling too much. So if you want to slow it down, you can go to playback speed, and you can move up here and slow it down, and then it'll be normal speed. But I'm doing 1x5 because I just can't listen to this guy drag on. I ain't no telling how long he's going to yap.
Dies as a result of your assault, you're guilty of murder. It's as simple as that. And what the defendant did here was a straight-up felony assault. This was not policing. It was unnecessary. It was gratuitous. It was disproportionate. And he did it on purpose. No question. This was not an accident. He did not trip and fall and find himself upon George Floyd's knee and neck. He did what he did on purpose. And it killed George Floyd. That force for 9 minutes and 29 seconds, that killed George Floyd. He betrayed the badge and everything it stood for. It's not how they're trained. It's not following the rules. This is not an anti-police prosecution.
We get it, dude. You don't want all the cops hating you because you went after the cops. We get it. You're all part of government, and they know that you normally support them. We get it. Okay, move on.
It's a pro-police prosecution. The defendant abandoned his values, abandoned the training, and killed a man. And why? Right out in the public, right out in broad daylight, in front of several bystanders as they looked in shock and horror. And why? Well, this all started over a call of an alleged counterfeit $20 bill. But George Floyd's life was taken for something worth far, far less. Far less. You saw the photo. You saw the body language. You can learn a lot about someone by looking at their body language. The defendant facing down that crowd. They were pointing cameras at him, recording him, telling him what to do, challenging his authority, his ego, his pride. Not the kind of pride that makes you do better, be better. The kind of ego-based pride. But the defendant was not going to be told what to do. He was not going to let these bystanders tell him what to do. He was going to do what he wanted, how he wanted, for as long as he wanted.
Now, I think that's a good point, and I think he's correct. Most cops don't like to be told what to do. They do have egos, and they aren't going to be told by the public on what to do because they don't have the training and they don't understand the whole situation. So, I mean, what he's saying here, I kind of agree with.
And there was nothing they could do about it because he had the authority. He had the power of the badge and the other officers.
Just like you have the power now to convict somebody that you really don't think is guilty, but is popular.
And the bystanders were powerless. They were powerless to do a thing. The defendant, he chose pride over policing. Remember, Charles McMillan, 61 years old, interesting man. Right? You remember when he testified, he had the glasses. If any of you in the front row, when he walked by, happened to notice his shoes, if you looked at his shoes, you probably saw your reflection in those shoes, right? He dressed for court like it was the most important day of his life. Interesting man. He was there. He's sort of narrating this horrific scene throughout. You hear him in the video. And he called out to George Floyd. He said, you can't win. You can't win. And George Floyd replied, I'm not trying to win. I'm not trying to win. I'm scared. But the defendant was trying to win. He wasn't going to be told what to do. He wasn't going to take a challenge to his authority. He was trying to win. And George Floyd paid for it with his life. Now, also need to be clear, this is not the trial of George Floyd. George Floyd is not on trial here. You've heard some things about George Floyd, that he struggled with drug addiction.
Oh, he struggled. Okay, I got it. It's the down for the struggle.
That he was being investigated for allegedly passing a fake $20 bill, that there was never any evidence introduced that he knew was fake in the first place. Right? But he is not on trial.
Oh, he didn't know it was fake. Oh, okay, I got it. He didn't know it was fentanyl that he was taking. He didn't know it was methamphetamine he was taking. He didn't know that fighting with the cops wasn't a good idea. He didn't know all. It wasn't his fault. It's never his fault. Or we'll burn down the city if it is.
He didn't get a trial when he was alive. And he is not on trial here. Defense claims that he was non-compliant. Non-compliant. Well, let's let's revisit what happened before the 9 minutes and 29 seconds. Before that, it's Memorial Day, right? May 25, 2020, and George Floyd is sitting in a car in the driver's seat with two friends. Now, previously he'd been in Cup Foods. He'd been in the store. He was walking. He was talking. He was breathing. As alive as any person, any human in this room.
Actually, he fell asleep in the car and they couldn't wake him up. But we don't want to talk about that.
Back to the car. He's with his friends, and there's a tap at the window. He looks to his left, and a start.
Actually, he had to be woken up by the passenger because he was asleep and he wouldn't wake up.
This is what he sees. This is what he sees. Within seconds of the approach, Officer Lane tapped on the window. Within seconds, he pulls his gun and holds it inches from George Floyd's face and starts shouting profanities. Show me your thing hands.
Actually, I don't think he drew his gun right away. He drew his gun when he started reaching inside. He was trying to get him out with both hands. So this is kind of, again, more lies misstating what really happened. He didn't draw his gun. He didn't walk up to that car this way. That attorney just flat out lied. But it's kind of like it's okay to lie during arguments. I don't know why.
Show me your effing hands. Screaming it. This is within seconds. You can tell a lot about someone by looking at their body language. How does Mr. Floyd look in this photo? Terrified?
Maybe he's scared because he knows he has drugs in the car and he's going to go to jail and he's got counterfeit money and he knows he's been convicted before and he knows he's under the influence. Maybe that's why he's scared. No, Rick. He's scared because it was a Memorial Day and he was a good guy. Okay.
An officer on the driver's side, an officer on the passenger side. Lane orders Floyd to put his hands on the steering wheel. He does. That's not resistance. That's compliance. Lane orders Floyd to get out of the car. He does. That's not resistance. That's compliance.
Are you kidding me? He doesn't get out. He hangs on the steering wheel. He reaches in. He's grabbing dope. He's eating dope.
They ordered him. They want him handcuffed. He is handcuffed. That's not resistance. That's compliance. And on the handcuffs, if you recall the testimony, they weren't properly double locked. And so they continue to ratchet. They're not on correctly. They're on too tight. Throughout, and you listen to the videos, throughout the videos, you can hear the sound of those handcuffs ratcheting tighter and tighter. Mr. Floyd is trying to explain to the police that his wrists hurt. Impervious to pain. Please. His wrists hurt. No one listens to him. But it continues. They tell him to go over to the Dragon Walk. He goes over to the Dragon Walk. That's not resistance. That's compliance. They ask him to sit down. He sits down. Not resistance. Compliance. Not trying to escape. Not trying to evade arrest. Not trying to assault anybody, shoot anybody, stab anybody, punch anybody. No. Compliance. Sits down on the ground. They ask him his name. He gives his name.
Actually, this goes to the cops were being nice, and when he was compliant, they weren't kneeling on him. They weren't jumping on him. They weren't grinding him into the ground. It was his actions that caused all that, not the cops.
He spells it. That's not resistance. That's compliance. They ask him to get up. He gets up. They ask him to go across the street. He goes across the street. Right, where's the resistance? Where's that? They take him over to the car. Okay?
Imagine if we didn't have video listening to this guy's story on what happened. You would think George Floyd was like going to get a cup of coffee and the cops jumped on him and kneeled on him for 9 minutes and killed him. I mean, the lies and the just misstating shit is just outrageous to me. It's just offensive. Scummy lawyers.
They take him over to the car. George Floyd is a big guy. Right? You can see here, I mean, he's almost as big as Officer Lane. He's a big guy. He's a big person. The back of the squad car is not. Right? That's what they wanted him to get into. And to George Floyd, he looked at that. What do you think that looked like?
Looked like a good place for me to spit my drugs out of my mouth before they find it on me. That's what it looks like.
Like a little cage. He tried to explain himself to the officers that he had anxiety.
So I wonder if you, Mr. DA, is going to somehow give your money and take a pay drop in order to get police bigger back areas so people don't have to get in small areas. Let's see how much you care, because you're appearing to care so much.
That he had claustrophobia. He explained this over and over. They wanted him to get in the back of this little car. And you know, he just wasn't able to bring himself to do it. He wasn't able to bring himself to do it.
Man, I'm scared as fuck, man. There's a reason don't go up on me, man. Okay, we got the three. I'm going in, please.
So he's trying to work out the ability to get in the car.
Man, we're going to have to watch all these videos again. I can just see it. I mean, this is going to go on for freaking ever. I don't even know if I want to listen to this. He just goes on and on and on. Jesus, man. We're at 45 minutes and he ain't said nothing to me that's convinced anything. So, I mean, except a bunch of freaking lies.
Bring themselves to get in. And this is not new. You don't call the police and say everything's fine. Just wanted you to know, right? That doesn't happen. Okay? Mental health issues, like drug and alcohol. Redondo took the stand. He testified that they have 4,000 calls for service for persons in crisis every single year. This is nothing new. Including that 40-hour crisis intervention course and the subsequent refresher course, should have known that and should have recognized it. Floyd was trying to get into the car. He was trying to work up the courage. He said he'd count to 3.
Oh, my God. Floyd was just
You
a victim.
recognized that and understood at that moment and that time, well, what is your goal? Where'd this critical thinking model go? Where'd that go? Where you take in information, you assess the information, you reassess the information, you consider what's the goal, what's the testified. They generally don't put people in custody for that, so they pull them out. Sir, in the defendant's position at that time should have recognized and understood, and I didn't need to. Not at all. For what? He's handcuffed. Protects against the known danger of positional asphyxia. And they have him there. He's right there. And this is where the excessive force begins. Okay? This is where the 9 minutes and 29 seconds start, because they didn't just lay him prone. They did not do that. They stayed on top of him with a knee on the neck and you need to sort of pull back and take a look. You've learned a lot about policies and procedures and tactics. You have to pull back and say, but for the defendant's actions pushing him down, would George Floyd have died that day?
If George Floyd hadn't passed counterfeit bills and fought with the cops, would he have died that day if he had not taken drugs? I mean, yeah, no. You got to ignore all that, and it's only the cops did it and Chauvin did it.
In that time, you've got to go to medical school here as jurors. There's so many benefits to being a juror. You got to go to medical school. You got that free parking.
Yeah, I went to medical school. I had 4 experts testify on how having a 90% blockage is normal and it won't cause any problems because the heart will fix itself. I had them say that having high blood pressure in 200s is absolutely no problem and it won't hurt you. That taking fentanyl and meth when you have those problems absolutely would not cause your death and is perfectly fine. That's what I learned in your medical school. Freaking dumbass.
Great lunches, fabulous pay. So now you get a little bit of a free law school education. The judge gave you a preview of that to keep those, do things.
I'm glad he thinks this is funny. He's trying to put this guy in prison for the rest of his life. And it's and he's making jokes with the jury.
Like focus your deliberations and just make the conversation a little easier, a little more focused. But you have these jury instructions as your guide. I think proof as ordinarily prudent men and women would act upon in their most important affairs. And a reasonable doubt is based on reason and common sense, not a fanciful or capricious doubt or beyond all possibility of doubt. So reasonable doubt, it's just as the name implies. Nor should you leave your common sense at the courthouse steps. As jurors, you must rely on your common sense. That's why you're here. We need you to apply that standard to these facts.
Well, hopefully they can use their common sense to think through your bullshit, because it's pretty thick.
And to be a judge of the facts and apply those facts and findings of facts to the law. And so proof beyond a reasonable doubt, it certainly is a high standard. It's the highest standard. It's a standard that the state has met here. And the state does not need to prove its case
just because you said it met it doesn't mean you met it.
Beyond all doubt. It does not need to prove its case beyond what I'll call an unreasonable doubt. Not required to prove beyond an unreasonable doubt. An unreasonable doubt is a doubt not based on common sense, but based on nonsense. And you're not required to accept nonsense. You're not required to accept the notion that after the defendant kneeling on Mr. Floyd for 9 minutes and 29 seconds in the dangerous prone position, handcuffed, restrained, pressing down on him, that after that, as he was writhing.
So after this closing, all the other attorneys that want to kiss this guy's butt are coming up to him, man, that was a brilliant closing, man. You did a great job. You're going to get... I mean, just watching these attorneys kiss their asses after they get filmed with a closing, you'd think they just won an Academy Award, for the Oscars or some shit, and they run around and pat each other on the back and feel good. And then when the jury doesn't side with them, they're like, they're freaking idiots. I did a great closing. Everybody said I did a great closing, and they still voted not guilty. Stupid jurors. So, I mean, people don't see the backside of this, but it's just, come on, dude, you're full of shit. Just go in there, lie, confuse the juries, throw out a bunch of mumbo jumbo and see if you can confuse them to vote guilty.
In pain and suffering, that's not even a use of force. George Floyd. You're not required to accept that or to consider that it is the bystander's fault for distracting the defendant. Is that common sense or is that nonsense? Tolerance. You know what the toxicology report says in terms of the levels, and you know what the testimony was about that. You die of a drug overdose. It's not common sense. That's nonsense. Believe your eyes. What you saw happen, happened. It happened. The defendant pressed down on George Floyd. They know a thing or two because they've seen a thing or two. They know a thing or two. Dr. Tobin knows a thing or two about how this works. You know what the law says those things are, and the law breaks down these different charges into things called elements. First element by the state required. Just like it's how it's lunchtime in court. The judge tells you it's lunchtime. You know when it's time to go. The judge tells you it's time to go. Same thing.
Oh, that's pretty funny. Yeah. A few minutes ago, I was crying because George Floyd was on the pavement, and I was emotionally upset. Now I'm laughing and joking. Yeah, perfect, dude. Yeah, this lawyer has credibility.
You know what the charges are. You know what the elements are because the judge tells you what the elements are. So you need to follow that. Okay? So, talking about murder in the second degree, first, the death of George Floyd must be proved, and then attempting to commit assault in the third degree. That's a felony level assault under the laws of Minnesota, and assault, 25 2000. So the first element, that George Floyd died. Well, that was established. That was established in the hospital. Consider these elements any way you second degree and in order of the third, and it's focus your deliberation. So I encourage you to do that, but you can do it any way you want. Okay. Second element, that the defendant caused the death of George Floyd. Okay. Causations. What does that mean? What does causation mean here? It means that the defendant's act or acts are a substantial causal factor in causing the death. He's criminally liable for all of the consequences of his actions that naturally occur, right, including those consequences brought about by intervening causes. The fact that other causes may have contributed to George Floyd's death just does not relieve the defendant of criminal liability.
Who thinks he's going to show the jury instruction where it says a reasonable officer is not guilty if he uses reasonable force? Who thinks he's going to go over that jury? Of course not. He's not going to go over it.
You have to find is that 9 minutes and 29 down. If there was a superseding cause, and we don't. When we talk about use of force, that's been defined by.
Oh, look! It looks like a bullseye. Let's shoot and kill. Wow, that's a great slide. Who come up with that? Let's make it look like a bullseye to simulate we're shooting. This is your target. Who's the target? Mr. Chauvin, the evil man. Ah.
That's been defined back seconds. And the experts have weighed in, and Dr. Langenfield told you that, Mr. Floyd, Dr. Eisenschmidt, they told you how it didn't happen. Floyd died as a result of a low level of oxygen. This low level of oxygen caused a brain injury.
Yeah, low level oxygen. And then he came back and testified that his oxygen level was 98% at the ER. How do you die of low oxygen level and you're at 98% at the ER? I call bullshit on that.
Injury and a PEA arrhythmia. Right? Mr. Floyd experienced a seizure. He passed out after his pulse stopped, his heart stopped. That cardiopulmonary arrest, that was the result of the police subdual and the risk of his oxygen. It would have cut off oxygen of someone who was perfectly healthy, handcuffed. The knees pushing on his neck and back downward, the pavement, the force of the pavement being unyielding. It was like he was in a vice, that he was being squeezed in a vice. No medical evidence of a heart attack. Okay? We heard from Dr. Rich. Dr. Rich actually treats people who have heart attacks, and he found there was metabolite, norfentanyl, that was well below the ratio of people who die from a fentanyl overdose. It's even below the median. And George Floyd's methamphetamine level.
So basically he hires his experts, pays them to say what he wants, then he gets to retestify on what the experts told him as if they came to that conclusion, not for payment, not because they want a job with the government getting money. No, they came with that conclusion because it must be fact. Therefore, you have to believe it. Really?
Level. That was 90 and tolerance because he used drugs in the past. Over this case, who and decided delirium hurt him. There were moments in time at that time, carbon monoxide, right? This car, which had a catalytic converter, that was outside, that was a hybrid, and there's no evidence was even on, right? That did not kill him. Right? He explained carbon monoxide saturation level. Oxygen saturation level, and based on his calculation of oxygen saturation level at 98%. At most, there could have been a 2% carbon monoxide. How
can you be at 98% and still die of low oxygen? That's That is total opposite. I mean, this is the smoking gun that should blow this case out of the water. There is no way you're convincing me a guy died of low oxygen when now you're saying his oxygen level was 98%, which is what a normal living human being has. How can he have the normal level and you're trying to tell me he died of low oxygen? Doesn't make sense.
CPR. If you would have left him in the scene, these actions were an assault.
More pictures, shocking.
We learned this pretty early on. We learned this pretty early on. Assault in the third degree requires that the defendant inflicted substantial bodily harm on George Floyd. Right? Substantial bodily harm meaning organs. A substantial harm. You find an order. The defendant caused George Floyd's death. He did. The state proved that beyond a reasonable doubt.
Just because you say it, don't make it so.
And at the time of causing the death, the defendant committed or was attempting an assault in the third degree. And that's been proved beyond a reasonable doubt. The defendant is guilty. So going back and talking about murder in the third degree, you can see that there's some...
If you're so convinced that he's guilty, why did you charge third degree? Why did you charge second degree? Why didn't you charge the one that you think he's so guilty of? Because he knows he's talking shit.
Elements in common. To committing an act highly likely to... This was a common sense defendant's, right?
More
not
video
talking.
footage.
There's not to these by stay. Conscious indifference.
Okay, we are at 56 minutes here. I'm going to stop this and see where the hell this goes. Okay, I'm not sure if it's over or not, but it's close here.
Own eyes. This case is exactly what you thought when you saw it first. When you saw that video, it is exactly that. You can believe your eyes. It's exactly what you believed. It's exactly what you saw with your eyes. It's exactly what you knew. It's what you felt in your gut. It's what you now know in your heart. This wasn't policing. This was murder. The defendant is guilty of all three counts. All of them. And there's no excuse. Thank you.
Members of the jury, we're going to take a 20-minute break, and just for your information, we'll also take a 20-minute break after the defense argument, before the state's rebuttal and the final instructions.
Okay, so I guess he is finished. We'll end that there.